Ukrainian forces are tired. No sign yet that the morale is at the low point where those forces would break. They've been pushing back against Russian counteroffensives around Avdiivka and elsewhere pretty heroically and effectively over the last couple of weeks. But they are very, very tired. That's true. And they may not get a winter break.
Let's start on the military side of things. And we'll start with you, General Chapman. In terms of the counter-offensive last year, there was an enormous pushback that took huge and held loads of ground for the Ukrainians. Where the lines are dug in now, it will not be as dramatic this year in any further push, will it?
No, I think you have to go back really to the start of the year when Mark Milley was still the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said this year it will be very, very difficult militarily to eject the Russian forces from every inch of the Russian occupied territories. And that is shown to be the case since the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians, probably from June. We've now got to the point where General Zaluzhny, who's always worth listening to, has said that the war has become positional and attritional, and to escape from this trap and break the operational deadlock, his words, not mine, they need to sort of alter the paradigm of what the combined arms warfare that we've traditionally talked about, artillery, tanks, infantry, air defense, engineers for mobility and counter mobility. And what he really needs is more loitering munitions, more drones, more counter drones, air superiority, and the F-16s will come on next year, and EW superiority. Now, they're not going to stop fighting. The tempo of operations is going to go down over the next few weeks, but they're not going to stop fighting for the simple reason that both Zelensky and General Tarnaski have said that if they do stop fighting at the moment, then Russia will restore, resupply, and reinforce. And of course, they can still do counter mobility actions, reinforcing their defensive lines, which the Ukrainians have not broken through. They've not even got to Tokmak. So in terms of sequencing their tactical battles for operational objectives, and of course the real operational objective from June was to break or cut the land bridge to Crimea, they failed to do that at the moment.
Well, Jamie, if I bring you in here, we just ran a package from Bucha, and I'd been speaking to an elderly lady there. It wasn't on the tape that we played, but when we were chatting, she was telling me that her nephew is an army medic on the front line. He's been injured 5 times. She'd been to visit him the day before in hospital with his latest concussion. His ambulance had hit a mine. But she said he had, when the war started, he was so enthusiastic for it. He wanted to go and fight for his country. But he says he's really, really tired now. He's exhausted, and it's very difficult out there. And I do wonder, when you've got a country the size of Russia, and yes, okay, Ukraine is an enormous land, but its population size is half that of Germany's, whether with every kind of month that passes, it tilts in Russia's favour, because one thing it has got is the opportunity to resupply people in a way that Ukraine just doesn't, and the people are becoming exhausted.
Well, absolutely, Ruth. And I have often said in the past that the irony is that sort of Russia wins by not losing and Ukraine loses by not winning. There is a great asymmetry in all of this. You're right, and it's true. The Ukrainian forces are tired. No sign yet that the morale is at the low point where those forces would break. They've been pushing back against Russian counteroffensives around Avdiivka and elsewhere pretty heroically and effectively over the last couple of weeks. But they are very, very tired. That's true. And they may not get a winter break because, as Chip rightly pointed out, on the one hand, there may be the temptation to have a winter pause to rest the troops for another effort at a spring offensive next year. But of course, the Russians, as they showed last winter, would then use that pause to dig themselves in to improve still further, tank traps, fortifications, lines of defense, put even more mines, which have been so difficult for the Ukrainian troops in the ground, and also improve their sensor capability, because what the Russians have really done, which has hurt the Ukrainians badly, is really improved their battlefield intelligence and their sensor capability so that they can more or less sort of see everything that the Ukrainians are doing and then put sort of missiles on those Ukrainian advances very, very quickly. So, yes, there is a difficulty there. I mean, President Zelensky is aware of the manpower problem, and the various officials have been fired for allowing military-age Ukrainian men to sort of sneak across the border into Poland and Germany and escape the draft. So there's definitely going to be a greater effort to make sure that everybody who is mobilizable is in Ukraine to be mobilized. That might sort of go some way to help the problem. But I think, as Chip says, given the manpower restraints, we've really got to look at how we can supplement that with more advanced technology. One final comment, though, let's not forget that if it's a stalemate for Ukraine, it's also a stalemate for the Russians. They've tried to counterattack, and we know, without having exact figures, that they've sustained quite major losses, both in terms of manpower and equipment. So they're stalemated as well. The only problem is that they've lost about 150,000 dead so far. In any other country in the world, the president would say, let's stop the operation. But clearly that doesn't happen in Russia.
Well, let's pivot from the military side of things onto the diplomatic, because actually the seeds of this war, both the initial annexation of Crimea in 2014 and this invasion, Russia has used a pivoting of Ukraine away from a sphere of Russian influence towards Europe as being a basis for their aggressive behaviour. And the pro-European feeling now in Ukraine from the week that I've just spent there is so much stronger. I mean, it's enormous. People want to. They feel like they've made a commitment to Europe, and they want Europe to open their arms and let them in. And the European Commission has recommended formal talks start. I think we've got a clip here of the Commission Chief Ursula von der Leyen speaking this week, talking about Ukraine's progress and saying membership is within reach.
First and most important, of course, is Ukraine's accession path to the European Union. I must say you have made excellent progress. This is impressive to see. We will testify to this next week when the Commission will present its report on enlargement. I want to tell you how impressed we are by the reforms you've made in the midst of a war. You should never forget you are fighting an existential war.
Well, Chip, I mean, that very, very public, very international encouragement is so important, particularly to the leadership who have made that decision about their pivot away from Russia to Europe, isn't it?
It does, and it's as much about politics and boosting morale in Ukraine as it is about the process that will go on in the future. And if you look at the non-material factors, which are really uppermost in making sure that people's will to continue remains extant, there's always four. The first one is that people will put up with great hardship as long as they all believe they're in it together. The second one, when there is still trust in their leadership. The third one, when there is confidence in ultimate victory. And the fourth one, relevant to this, is the belief in a better post-war world. And it's that a pivot towards the EU. And don't forget the pivot which was announced in the NATO communique in July this year at Vilnius about the future accession to NATO. So both of those are important in sustaining morale for the future. And as we say, total means multiplied by your strength of will gives you your power of resistance. You've got to break both of those to ensure that an enemy either surrenders or will negotiate. And I think both of those are still extant for the Ukrainians at the moment.
And Jamie, I mean, what I heard time and time again was also, look, we thank our Western allies for their help, but we need more and we need it faster. And keeping that commitment, which again, the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Japan this week said that they would be with Ukraine till the end. It is so important that they don't just say it, that they actually deliver it and deliver it on time.
Absolutely, Ruth. That is key because Russia has its allies too, such as Iran or North Korea or China, but it's much more able itself to generate its missiles, its manpower, its tanks and so on, whereas Ukraine is very dependent still, of course, on Western help and Western supplies. The first factor here, and this is a message I always give to my Ukrainian friends and colleagues, is that you've got to realize that this Western support will have limits. For political reasons, the situation currently with Republicans in the US Congress, the fact that now many US weapons will need to be diverted to Israel, the same kind of air defense weapons and artillery that Ukraine would need. But secondly, many NATO countries are simply running out of stocks. and are using their budgets to resupply themselves to backfill for what they've sent already to Ukraine. So I think the first message is that Ukraine has to really work very hard to develop its own domestic defense industry, to have as much production at home as it can. And you probably, while you were in Ukraine, have seen that they've appointed a very young 30-year-old to take charge of modernizing their defense industry with 500 private companies on the market, and to really try to ramp this up. And it won't happen overnight, of course. The second element, of course, is that Ukraine is asking for lots of money for other things as well. For example, it's asked the EU for 40 billion euros simply to fill its budget deficit for this year, along with reconstruction and humanitarian aid. So it's going to be a big ask. We've got obviously the attention now being diverted away because of the situation in Gaza. And I think that inevitably, given the situation in the United States, where Republicans have separated the Ukrainian package from the Israeli package, that the Europeans have got to look very hard at themselves and see what more they can do to help Kiev, particularly to get through the winter. That, of course, doesn't only mean military supplies, but energy and those kind of things as well.
Indeed. Jamie Shea, former NATO Deputy Secretary General, and before that, retired British Army General Chapman, thank you for joining us.